So my background, well, it's interesting. My story starts with trying to be creative. When I became sort of 15, 16, I did the classic thing. I joined a band and became obsessed with becoming the most creative band ever. You know, I thought we've got to break the rules, we've got to break boundaries, we've got to do music which has never been done before. I don't know where that came from, but I became passionate about, and I was very anti just bands who were derivative stylistically. So I really love bands who seem to be pushing the envelope, like Sonic Youth. And yeah, I did that for 2 or 3 years. And ultimately, looking back, I think I failed to produce the kind of music that I aspired to produce. I mean, being creative is very hard, obviously. Now, I'm sure I produce some good stuff, but I don't think I scaled the heights of amazing, phenomenal music. I then sort of put that to one side and then discovered anthropology. When I was about 19 or 20, I discovered anthropology, and that became another obsession of mine. That became a huge, sort of a first intellectual love. I ended up going to the University of East London and studying anthropology there. And I usually, anthropology, you tend to study one side or the other side. So you'll do social or cultural anthropology. You're studying so-called Bible societies, ways of life, habits, and so on, religious systems and economic systems and this kind of thing, typically done through ethnography. That's the social or cultural side. Or you do the evolutionary or Darwinian side. So you try to model how and why we developed biologically and culturally over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. You know, that's very dependent on paleontology and archaeology and those sort of more scientific fields. So you tend to do one or the other, but what I discovered was a form of anthropology that just really brought them together. So it was a sense of trying to explain everything about humanity, and so I studied it. Pretty much my undergrad was focused on both of those sides of it. And through it, actually fairly early on, I started realizing that I was able to focus on the creativity, the creative aspect of humanity through anthropology. And in fact, the guy who ran the course that I studied at University of East London, Professor Chris Knight, he has his own theory of the revolutionary origins of mankind. In fact, it's often referred to as the human revolution. This happened perhaps 40 or 50,000 years ago. Some think it's a little earlier, maybe 100,000 years ago. It's referred to by all sorts of revolutionaries of language. The human revolution, the creative explosion, it's often called. He had his own theory, which was fascinating and very interesting, and I delved into that. But I soon came to realize that I was able to turn my mind to the subject of creativity intellectually, and to almost, I almost set out on a quest to say, okay, if I couldn't write, it wasn't quite as simple as this, but if, you know, my obsession was with being creative. Well, how is one creative? How do people attain this incredible level of creativity? And also from not just the great minds of history and prehistory, but just everyday creativity. How does it work? So for me, anthropology became my lens for looking at the whole subject. And I think it's a uniquely powerful one. You tend to find people who are studying creativity scientifically. You tend to find they're neuroscientists, psychologists, and so on. Then you'll have people studying creativity as creatives, as artists, as advertising creatives, product designers, of course. Or you'll have business people, innovators who talk about how they created things, how they innovated things. You don't get many anthropologists talking about creativity. And, you know, in many senses, anthropology is not about creativity. In a sense, it's about replicating behavior, trying to understand patterns of behavior that have been passed down the generations. So in a sense, you're not looking for change particularly, but some anthropology is all about change. So the evolutionary origins of mankind is all about how we transition fundamentally from an animal species, if you like, to a human species through the origins of what we call culture, which is the same thing as the origins of creativity. You know, when did we start using grammatical language? When did we start making art using symbolism, having morality that transcended just sort of person to person groups and actually encompassed an entire society? When did we start developing complex, sophisticated tools. All of these things that we associate with culture with a capital C are about creativity. How did we solve these problems in the environment that enabled us actually to spread across the globe 50,000, 100,000 years ago? So that has always been my anchor point, and everything that I look at in creativity comes from there. And it's interesting because one of the most famous quotes about about creativity, is by Steve Jobs. He said, "Creativity is just connecting things," and really, that's what anthropologists do. We're a very connective discipline. You know, we try to sit at the center of things and pull in some insights and research from science, some from the humanities, some from today, some from the past. It's all about connecting things and then finding connections, not just say within a society, trying to understand how different aspects and levels of the society operate within that society, and then trying to find connections between societies too. So anthropologists connect things a lot. So for me, anthropology gives you that kind of connective thinking process that's perfect for studying creativity and for being creative. So that's where I came from, and you know, I find it's a very, like I said, it's a very powerful way to look at things.
Yes, indeed. And you talk about evolution a lot in terms of anthropology, and one of the shifts in our thinking arose, you know, not so long ago, you know, 300-400 years ago, during the time of Renaissance and Darwin's theories of evolution. Because before Darwin, before the Renaissance, the general consensus was that creativity was the domain of the gods. Only gods and goddesses could be created, which came from the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, who said that all we could do was merely uncover what already existed. And then Darwin, with his theories of evolution, made it, he acknowledged human I suppose he empowered human beings to realize that they also were responsible for their own adaptation and mutation. So do you think that Darwin was like one of the revolutionaries in terms of creativity in association with anthropology?
Yeah, I mean, he didn't particularly address human creativity, but his view on adaptation is actually central to the consensus definition of creativity today, which is that for an idea to be creative, it has to be new or novel and useful or adaptive. And so quite a few theorists have taken this notion of adaptation, as central to whether or not something is creative. If it's not adaptive, if it doesn't help you in your environment, in your social environment or your day-to-day environment, then it's not creative fundamentally. It might be ingenious in its own way, but if it's not helping you to adapt, then it's not helping you, then it's not fundamentally creative. And I do think that he was able to make us understand that, in a sense, nature is creative. What we tend to do, we often, as humans, we come up with solutions that are new and adaptive. The reason why we call it creativity is that we're able to do so on the spot. In evolution, those adaptations can be new and non-obvious, which is another one of the definitions of creativity. It's just that they tend to take a lot longer. So in a sense, I think that he was saying that absolutely nature is creative. Nature is a creative domain. It's not the case that species have existed since the Garden of Eden in the same form. They have fundamentally generated new forms and effectively created new forms. The reason, as I said, why we don't tend to think, and I don't think that the development of, say, winged flight would be creative in the way that I talk about creative, is that it's taken place over a long period of time, thousands, if not millions of years. Human beings were able to come up with novel and valuable or adaptive ideas on the spot like that. That's why I think that we are different from the rest of life in nature. But I really think that, yes, he was at the forefront of making us understand that change is universal, and that in a sense stasis is the opposite of creativity.
And he also spoke about natural selection. You know, natural selection is an an integral aspect of evolution, and I suppose that applies to creativity, because not all ideas are valuable and useful, and society needs to evaluate these ideas to sort out the wheat from the chaff, as it were.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
So when you speak about the grammar of creativity, the tools that, you know, enable people to speak the language of creativity, how did you develop, what influenced you to develop that grammar of creativity?
Well, so I've always been interested in the deep reality of things. And I think one of the theorists that had most impact on me, Claude Lévi-Strauss, the structuralist anthropologist, who tried to find the deep logic behind all myth. He ended up being a fairly controversial figure in many senses, and in my own view, his solution to the problem was not accurate. But I love the daring, the ambition of his goal to say, look, what's going on beneath the surface level of all myths and these hundreds and thousands of stories we see? Is there something going much deeper? And he used the analogy of linguistics, which is that sentences and words are the surface level structure, but there's a deeper set of rules, grammatical rules, which underpin that. He actually explicitly used the linguistic model to try to decode myth in this sense. So my project has been to try to do the same thing, to try to understand what are the deep rules of creativity, because of course creativity is incredibly diverse. It's diverse within one particular field, let's say art, but it also transcends art. I mean, and this is something that a lot of creativity theorists will tell you, of course, that creativity is so much more than art. For me, most creativity actually happens outside of art. It will happen in technology, in leadership, in all sorts of, I mean, just everyday social interaction can be incredibly creative. And for me, it's this sense of trying to get to the bottom of what's going on. I was also very interested, in 1999, I read an article by V.S. Ramachandran, who's a neuroscientist. He wrote an article called The 8 Laws of Artistic Experience. And he tried to identify what at the cognitive, neurological level, what are the key principles that seem to underpin the generation and appreciation of art. And he had, like I said, he had 8 principles, I think symmetry, something called peak shift, conceptual grouping, some others. I found this really exciting. So my project has been to try to dig up the key features of this, of creativity, of what's going on beyond the surface level of here's a product, or here's a piece of art, or here's a joke. What's going on at the deepest possible cognitive level? And I've been driven by that for 20 years now. Yeah, my findings point to a whole series of things. Many of the principles are known by creativity scientists. I mean, one, for example, the principle of combination. Combination is understood very widely to be at the heart of how creativity happens. And then you need to dig deeper to find some other principles, and that's something I've been trying to do. For me, one of the most powerful reasons for talking about creativity as a language is that it tells people, and it shifts your thinking to be able to say, well, it's something you can learn, because that's absolutely central to what I do as well, which is that I think anybody can be creative. Now, I'm not one of those people who says everyone's creative. Probably everybody has had a creative thought in their life, but I do think creativity is hard to achieve because of our various cognitive biases. But I do think everybody can be creative, given the right tools, given the right understanding. And I mean, scientific research has actually shown that if you put people through a short training program using some basic techniques, they will then improve their scores on just the standard creativity test, which is fascinating. That just backs up what I've always felt and I've always said, which is you can take somebody who says, oh, I'm not creative, I can't be creative. If you just say to them, look, it's not some mysterious gift, it's just a language, and there are certain rules you can learn, there are certain procedures you can internalize that will enable you to start speaking this language. That's something that can't be done overnight, in the same way that learning a language, learning a foreign language might take you months or even years to really internalize this logic into your unconscious mind. But I think it's something everybody can do, depending on whether they want to. And I think that that's something which is another thing that I'm very interested in doing, which is just telling people you really need to be creative, particularly in the context of the modern world where AI is now rendering an awful lot of people obsolete. How can you stand out if your job can be taken by a computer, fundamentally? Well, I think that the one thing that AI cannot do to this point, may never be able to do, but people are working on it, is be creative. So if you, the way I talk about it, if you want to future-proof your brain, you should make it more creative, because you can guarantee that in 5 or 10 years, if you're able to offer creative value to the company you're working in, or whatever role you have, you're not going to be replaced by a computer. So for me, these are the reasons I like to look at creativity as a language. Number one, I think it's exciting because it's about let's dig and let's find those grammatical rules. Number two, anyone can learn a language. We know that. So yes, this orientated me to think it's a useful sort of model to approach creativity, rather than say it's a gift or it's an innate talent or so
you're looking at it as a skill rather than a gift or a talent. And it's interesting when people say, well, everyone can be creative, and I think it's important to bear in mind that the place or the location or the context is important too. And I'm saying this bearing in mind that today the local prison in Birmingham, I'm based in Birmingham, and the prison in Birmingham has been taken over by the government today because the authorities lost control. The inmates have taken over control. So even in prison, people can be creative. People can be creative in undermining authority in all kinds of situations. But a young offender might say, well, I'm in prison, how can I be creative? And at the linguistic level, at the behavioral level, there's always the scope, isn't there, to be creative?
Listen, what you're saying is absolutely true. And one of the messages I've sort of developed in recent times is that when we talk about an idea, to be creative, you have to have an idea, a creative idea. But when we think of an idea, we tend to think of, related to creativity, we think of a design, sort of an image, some kind of concept. That's a creative idea. But for me, a creative idea can be just let's say, a decision. So famously in 1914, Henry Ford decided overnight to double his workers' wages. So he doubled his workers' wages from $2.50 to $5 an hour. It's called the $5 a day. He wanted to increase staff retention and increase morale, and he thought it was only right that the people working on his cars ought to be able to buy one. It was seen as absolute heresy at the time. The Wall Street Journal said this is virtually criminal. Is the way that they described it. So for me, it was a new idea. Nobody had done that before. It was valuable because it worked. Within a year or two, Ford had doubled their profits. Staff retention dropped from thousands down to a handful. So it was valuable, and it was a very sort of surprising or non-obvious solution. Now, this idea, when you think of Henry Ford, you think, oh, he's an innovator of cars. For me, just as creative is this decision that he took. So this is a very run-of-the-mill, administrative, stroke of the pen decision, which was a phenomenally creative decision. So when I say creative decision, I don't mean decision about creativity. I'm talking about decisions that are creative. And yeah, as a manager, as a leader, if someone like Henry Ford or anyone, even in any scenario in your everyday life, even in something like a prison, a decision that you take can have all of the attributes of a creative idea. So for me, creativity, absolutely, it's not just for the high-minded and the geniuses or even the artists and the designers. It's for everyday people in everyday situations. But very often it's hard to have those ideas because of cultural programming and because of our innate cognitive biases. So being creative isn't straightforward. It's not as easy as to say, I'll just come up with something new. It's got to actually overcome your biases in many ways, and they are so deeply ingrained in all of our brains that very often of course, when somebody has a creative idea, someone says, why didn't I think of that? Well, you didn't think of that because of your cognitive bias, you know? So I love your example of the prison. I think that if everybody on the planet, see, sometimes it's said, oh, there should be more creativity, let's say, in schools. And by that, people think that we're talking about, let's say, do more painting. Well, yes, that can be a form of creativity. But for me, creativity should spread as a sort of a form of thought, as a way of looking at your problems, your challenges, and finding a creative solution. It's not just about art. It can be about absolutely run-of-the-mill, everyday things. You can come up with a creative solution. I mean, I wrote a blog post recently about how a guy had been interacting with a girl on Twitter, on Tinder, and he just came up with a really nice little inventive way of talking to her. So he gave her these options, and then it was like a little role-playing game. Now, this is a very sort of unelevated domain. It's it's the mating game, it's the flirting game. He had a nice little creative idea, and it worked. You know, she really liked it. I think she posted it, she said, yeah, and they went out on a date. So, you know, even in something as sort of everyday as flirting activity, being creative can be hugely beneficial. One thing that I think could be done is a better test of creative thinking. The tests that we do have are quite old, and I think the evidence is pretty weak that they are good measures of creative thinking. So that's something that I may be working on in future. I hopefully will. One of the other very big questions is the role of AI and whether AI can be creative, as I pointed out earlier. I'm very interested to see where that research is going to go, because I think if computers were able to be as inventive as we are, I'm not sure any jobs could be carried out by humans anymore. So either we'll all be redundant, or we'll just have to retire and live off the robots. I think my main point about creativity would be everybody should be more creative, and that's not because creativity pervades every single moment of your life. Let's face it, most of the things we do, most of the tasks we carry out, they shouldn't be creative. And there's a reason for that. You have a particular goal, a particular task, and a particular procedure to carry out. And you carry it out accurately, great, I've got my shopping. You know, you don't want to go on creative shopping trips all the time. But sometimes the big decisions that you do make, they can require creative thinking, and they can be the most important consequential decisions in your life. And that can be in personal life and in one's professional life. So again, I use the Henry Ford example. Who knows how long it took Henry Ford to come up with this idea, but it was so consequential, and it was such a sort of a down-to-earth administrative stroke of the pen. You know, anybody who has a job may be able to come up with a creative solution that later they will be able to look back and say, wow, that was really important for me and my team or my own journey or whatever. So that's my message to everyone, which is that everybody should be more creative, and you've got to find a way to learn how to be more creative.